The United States of the Fallout universe was a land of extremes. Technological innovation made consumer goods of personal computers, sophisticated robots, and even fusion power. But war, famine, and political unrest were also a part of everyday life. Internationally, the collapse of oil production had destroyed the global order as nations fought each other for the last productive wells. The European Commonwealth and the Middle Eastern states had ruined each other in a war for the last of the Middle East's oil. The US was in a somewhat better condition as the oil fields of Alaska were still productive over a decade later. In 2066, though, the Communist Chinese invaded Alaska to seize those oil fields, leading to over a decade of fighting between the United States and China. By 2076, the United States was winning in Alaska, and new fronts were opening in mainland China. Power armor, having been battle-tested in the Anchorage campaign, was being deployed to the new front lines, with devastating results for the defending Chinese. While many Americans were sick of the war and the associated shortages, it looked like the fighting might finally be going their way. This increased success, though, came with a potential of an increasingly desperate Chinese government that might resort to more drastic options. The Middle Eastern resource wars had turned nuclear in 2053, and the fear of global thermonuclear war was rising. In response, the United States had initiated Project Safehouse, a program that resulted in the creation of the Vault-Tec Corporation, which hastily built scores of shelters known as vaults across the United States. In Appalachia, those already suspicious of the military-industrial complex did not trust these vaults, and thus they began to build their own shelters. As their distrust of the government grew, they even began to discuss separating themselves from their country entirely. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of the Free States movement. While in structure, the Free States movement was a loosely knit union largely composed of families, the heart of the group can be found in its two founders, Raleigh Clay and Samuel Blackwell. Best friends since childhood, both would eventually lead lives heavily influenced by their personal politics. Sam Blackwell rose from his position as a union activist working for the coal miners of Appalachia to becoming one of the most popular United States senators of his day. With his reputation as a champion of the people, he was soon the recipient of information leaks about the corruption of the United States government. The information he was privy to was disturbing, from corporatist corruption to secret bioweapons programs operated by the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Defense creating a better early warning system for itself than for the people. It was becoming clear that the government was far from its mandate. The military-industrial complex ran the show, and the government was an organization of, by, and for the military-industrial complex. When Sam attempted to share what he knew with the public, he was threatened by members of the government, but he couldn't just sit on this information, so he shared what he knew with his best friend of over 30 years, Raleigh Clay. Knowing that the government was acting against the best interest of its citizens, the two began to plan a future for their families apart from their nation. While Sam would keep his anti-government standing to himself for the time being, Raleigh, a Harpers Ferry native, started to evangelize to those in his community. While some took offense to his statements, there were those for whom the message resonated and a movement began to grow. Fearing that nuclear war was near, and knowing that Vault-Tec was a part of the military-industrial complex, the nascent movement began to construct bunkers of their own. In late 2076, the Free States movement began to stock these new shelters, with goods bought across the region. As the growing movement continued its evangelism, it began to experience more and more pushback from patriotic citizens of the area who didn't care for the criticism of their country. Disagreements turned violent, and there were fights in the streets of Harpers Ferry. The Free Staters viewed their actions as an attempt to save their friends and neighbors from a government that was indifferent to the point of contempt towards its own citizens, while outsiders viewed the Free Staters as delusional to the point of treason. Along with readying themselves to ride out the bombs in their shelters, the Free Staters also wanted to be ready to survive outside as well. To that end, Free Stater and owner of the Vest training ground, Eddie Hayes, hosted survival courses for many of his fellow Free Staters. Opposition to the Free States continued to grow. The Free Stater Carson family of Berkeley Springs was banned from receiving medical attention in the Harpers Ferry Clinic. Harpers Ferry Mayor Miranda Vox told Raleigh Clay to, quote, "shove his movement where the sun don't shine and get the hell out of her town," unquote. Government agents descended on Harpers Ferry to get a handle on the movement. Anti-Free States propaganda began to go up on the walls of Harpers Ferry, equating the anti-government group with communism. With tempers rising, a particularly bad street fight got out of control, an event that would be remembered as the Clay Riot. Raleigh Clay was arrested. Though Sam Blackwell had managed to conceal his connection to the Free States as public perception of the group soured, he would not remain silent as his best friend sat in prison. In June 2077, Senator Blackwell, although warned against doing so by multiple sources, requested a full investigation into the wrongful arrest of Raleigh Clay. Despite the negative publicity that came with backing Raleigh Clay in the Free States, Senator Blackwell became adamant in his public support. Even once Raleigh Clay was freed from prison, Senator Blackwell continued to speak out. Conditions for the Free Staters continued to worsen as the summer of 2077 wore on. Caleb Carson's wife Elizabeth and their two children Madeline and Max were killed by anti-Free Staters, leading Caleb to commit suicide in the bunker intended to host his now deceased family. In late August 2077, threats against his family drove Senator Blackwell underground. After an initial period of confusion at his disappearance, he gave an interview to Charleston Herald journalist Quinn Carter from his concealed bunker. He told Ms. Carter why he had run, about the potential risks posed to the American people from their government, and he warned that the end was coming soon. He closed the interview by resigning his seat as a United States Senator and handed her documents declaring the secession of the Free States from the United States of America. The news of the Free States removing themselves from society was met with mixed reactions, ranging from the view that they were paranoid fools to the view that they were traitors. The Charleston Herald suffered fairly major blowback for publishing Senator Blackwell's words while refusing to reveal his location. The replacement of the senator became a major ballot issue for the upcoming election. The state government sealed his office at the Capitol and began an investigation, while the federal government decided to let the Free Staters stew in their bunkers until they could free up the resources to drag them out for punishment. The Free Staters didn't have long to wait for their predictions of doom to come to pass. On the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077, a global nuclear exchange was initiated, ending the old world, turning the Free Staters from paranoid to prophetic. Within hours, some of those that had once sought their destruction were pounding furiously on the doors, begging for entry. Unfortunately, there was little that could be done at that point. It wasn't safe to open up, even if they had the room to take in more survivors. Regardless of however low the odds that one of those survivors might try to take the bunker for themselves, it wasn't worth the risk. After a time, life in the bunkers returned to what it had been before the bombs. Everyone performed chores. Parents educated their children. They played board games together. For most of them, this life would last for nearly 2 years. On November 20th, 2078, the bunkers were shaken by another explosion. For those within the northern bunkers, this event was far more extreme as red strangler vines burst through the concrete walls with enough force to kill the dwellers within. These vines would continue to creep across the mire, breaching bunkers when they reached them, ensnaring equipment, making life difficult for those within. Around the start of the summer of 2079, Raleigh Clay called out to the Free States bunkers and announced an all clear. The world outside was safe enough for them to leave their bunkers and return to the surface. For these people who had spent the better part of the last 2 years living a stunted version of their lives before the bombs, the changes to the environment were stark. Where there had once been forested ridges and valleys, there was now a festering swamp that bred monsters. They had been expecting changes, but nothing so dramatic as this. Ella Ames, one of the more brilliant among the group, remarked, "Darwin would lose his mind out here." Before the bombs, Ella, a VTU-educated doctor, had been pursued by West Tech Huntersville for their biotechnology programs. Now, she would use her extensive knowledge of Appalachian biology and her medical training to study the world created by the bombs and work to save the lives of her fellow survivors. Out of their lockdown, Free States agents moved across the region doing reconnaissance work. In the search for ammunition, a pair of scouts found the converted munitions factory to be a gold mine of material. At the Thunder Mountain power plant, a small group seized the plant and proceeded to hold it, fighting off small groups of raiders. They managed this until a paramilitary group surrounded the plant. Clearly remnants of some former military unit, this group, calling itself Taggarty's Thunder, demanded that they vacate the power plant, offering them safe passage out if they would leave peacefully. Unlike the raiders, these soldiers were organized and disciplined. When the Free States abandoned the plant, true to their word, the soldiers let them pass unharmed. As the sightings of the Free States members outside increased, word filtered back to the remnants of the local governments. In Harpers Ferry, the word that Raleigh Clay had been seen walking around led Mayor Miranda Vox to venture out to his bunker. She apologized for having insulted him before the war, and asked if he would help the people of Harpers Ferry. Raleigh decided to see the conditions in Harpers Ferry with his own eyes, and he set out with his daughter Martha. When he witnessed the horrible state of those that were scraping by in the ruins of his hometown, he knew he needed to help. He returned to his bunker and put out a call to the rest of the Free States. While a prominent member of the movement, Raleigh wasn't their commanding officer. He could only request that they assist in the reconstruction efforts. There was a lot of bad blood between the Free States and their old neighbors. The non-Free Staters had beaten them up, banned them from necessary businesses, put them in jail, and even killed them. While it would be understandable for the Free Staters to turn their noses up at their former persecutors, many families did answer the call for help. The Free States began to turn things around at Harpers Ferry immediately. To protect the people of the town, walls went up, enclosing the streets, creating a safe zone, while formal patrols and watch duties were established to guard those walls. With the town secured, the Free States seized the reconstructed Harpers Ferry Armory to serve as their local headquarters. Within this structure, Neeraj Singh, a Free State's engineer, widower, and father of two, designed an air scrubber. The general air quality in Harpers Ferry wasn't great thanks to the swampy conditions that had arisen in the aftermath of the bombs, but it was made all the worse by radiation storms that would blow new fallout in from neighboring regions. Neeraj's air scrubber worked, and thus the Free States would end up installing 15 of them around the town. Ella Ames worked to re-establish the Harpers Ferry Clinic, receiving the assistance of Neeraj Singh's daughter Abby, Raleigh Clay's daughter Martha, a former esthetician Lucy Harwick, and even Miranda Vox, who stepped down as mayor. In speaking with the former mayor, Ella gained an insight into the state of the environment of the region. Miranda explained that in late October 2078, an ambassador from Vault 94, a nearby Vault-Tec vault, had arrived bringing offers of food and supplies. Too busy to deal with this news at the time, she sent a delegation to the vault. Not long after, there was an explosion that rattled the area, and a fog was seen drifting from the entrance of the vault. Suddenly, the swamp, the monsters, the red strangler vines all made sense. Ella correctly deduced that there had been a mishap at the Garden of Eden creation kit, and that this had led to the radical environmental transformation. While she now knew why the area had become the mire, nothing could really be done about it, so she focused her efforts on the clinic. Soon, she would receive assistance in this effort from over the mountains to the west. At the time of the bombs, as the Free Staters were enjoying the fruits of their preparations, the first responders of Charleston, West Virginia were working their hardest to stem the tide of the chaos. While there was an emergency government formed from the remains of the state government, the first responders rapidly organized into the Responders, developing their autonomy until the Charleston emergency government became little more than advisors. When government scouts spotted Free Staters outside their bunkers, they told the Responders, and the Responders sent a scout over the mountains. Responder Derek J. Castle arrived in Harpers Ferry, and the two organizations made first contact. Derek promised Ella supplies when he returned, and soon a whole group of Responders, headed by Maria Chavez, arrived. With the help of Maria Chavez, Ella Ames was able to properly restore the clinic to operational status, and the two of them would form a working relationship that would come in handy over the coming years as they studied the creations of the new world. A young Free Stater named Lydia, enamored with the responder DeAndre, decided to go to work at the clinic to get to see him, and they would soon strike up a relationship. Trade opened up between the Responders and the Free States, leading to cross-mountain caravans. It wasn't long after they met the Responders that the Free States were again confronted by Taggarty's Thunder, the paramilitary force that had seized Thunder Mountain Power Plant from them. Now calling themselves the Brotherhood of Steel, they were now headquartered in Eddie Hayes' old survivalist training camp, which they had renamed Camp Venture. This interaction went much better for the Free States, as the Brotherhood was friendlier than before and started to help protect the trade routes across the mountains. The persecution and hate from the time before the bombs was fading, and the rehabilitated survivors of Harpers Ferry and the Free Staters were forming a community together. With protection, medical care, and trade established, Harpers Ferry was back on its feet. As for those Free Staters who had chosen not to join in the reconstruction efforts, life was not easy. In late September 2081, a small group of them was on the run from a band of raiders when they found refuge in a child's treehouse. They used the height advantage to take down the raiders, and over the coming 2 months they expanded the treehouse into multiple trees connected by walkways. This turned out to only be a temporary shelter, as they were assaulted again in November, leading them to realize that this new base wasn't as safe as they'd hoped it would be. Back in Harpers Ferry, while things had severely improved from the darkest days of the aftermath of the bombs, there were still many issues facing the town. New diseases ran through the population without known cures. Monsters stalked through the swamp, hurting, maiming, and killing wastelanders. Lydia began to question her desire to work in the clinic after one of her friends, Connor, bled out in front of her after having had his leg torn off. The conditions in the clinic were too much for Abby Singh, and so she resigned her position, choosing to tinker with electronics beside her father Neeraj. As bad as most of the monsters were, they didn't cause the psychological fear that was brought on by another new phenomenon. Wastelanders reported sick, shambling people that were known to violently attack without provocation or mercy. These people were hairless, with drooping skin that would slough off at times. Soon referred to as ghouls, there was little known about them nor the cause of their condition. Ella Ames began to study their corpses, leading her to pity them as they had once clearly been just like anyone else in town. She and Maria Chavez performed many autopsies to try to find the cause of their ghoulification. While they learned that their immune system had effectively been replaced by radiation and that radiation could regenerate their tissues, there wasn't anything obvious about the cause of their condition. Why, when exposed to radiation from the bombs, they had turned into this instead of dropping dead. Though they didn't have any answers on that, rumors were beginning to spread that not all ghouls were mindless killers. Some were said to speak before they were killed. This was confirmed to be the case when Harpers Ferry resident Daniel Whitby was discovered to have become a ghoul. Daniel had been recovering from what most had assumed to be a bad flu, tended to by Lucy Harwick. When it was discovered that he had become a ghoul and that Lucy had been trying to hide his condition long enough to cure him, she was forced to flee town and Daniel was quarantined. Despite the work of Ella Ames and Maria Chavez, there was still a lot of prejudice towards ghouls at the time, due to just how new the phenomena of ghoulification was. While radiation had been correctly deduced to be most of the cause of the condition, there were those who feared that it was a contagious disease, and they wanted Daniel thrown out of town, either exiled alone or sent to the Responders HQ in Charleston. Things did not greatly improve for the sentient ghouls over the next few years as they faced constant prejudice due to their appearance. They ended up forming a new community together in the ruined Valley Galleria Mall, where they could live without fear of persecution, at least for the time being. As for the Responders' headquarters in Charleston, it sadly had a shorter life expectancy. On Christmas Day 2082, the city was drowned in the waters of Summersville Lake when the dam holding the lake back was destroyed by raiders. This nearly broke the Responders, and while they regrouped in Morgantown under Maria Chavez, it would take time before they could return to prominence. Over the course of that time, the Free Staters would suffer as well as more diseases swept through the mire, killing many. In early 2084, a familiar face appeared in Harpers Ferry. Sam Blackwell, having spent the majority of the past 6.5 years underground, came looking for his old friends. Mentally, he wasn't all that he'd once been. Fighting the dementia that had been diagnosed before the bombs required a constant fight, one that was waged with Mentats, either the store-bought kind or the homemade ones his daughter had synthesized. Sam had taken the threat against his family to heart, and thus even when Raleigh sent out the all-clear signal, he and his daughter kept to themselves. He was sure that the military-industrial complex that had made the threat against him was still out there, looking for him. He had left the bunker for walks, but he'd always avoided human contact. When he had once seen his daughter speaking with a pair of wastelanders, he had watched and waited for her to leave. Once she was out of sight, he killed them both, fearing that they might be government agents out to get him or her. Sam and his wife Emily had divorced days before the bombs, with the court proceedings held in his absence. Judith was all he had left. In early 2084, Judith succumbed to a disease after a short illness, leaving Sam all alone. He buried his daughter on the hill overlooking the bunker. The disease which killed his daughter had bothered Sam, for reasons aside from her illness and death. He felt as though he'd seen it before, as though it were something he'd read about in reports from the Department of Agriculture from before the bombs. He felt so strongly about this that he'd prepared to drag her across the wasteland on a homemade stretcher to get treatment at the White Spring Resort. He knew of the congressional bunker beneath the site, and he knew that it played a part in the plans of the military-industrial complex before the bombs. He knew that if they were still there, they would execute him on arrival, but that they might save her life. Though he was willing to trade his life for hers, it was too late. She passed before they could leave. Weeks after her demise, starved of human contact, he traveled to Harpers Ferry. He was greeted by his old friend Raleigh, who respected his desire to stay out of the spotlight, letting him stay in the armory. Unfortunately, it would soon become evident that Sam's paranoia was justified. While standing in line for dinner, he felt a pair of eyes on him and realized he was being watched by a newcomer. Careful not to show that he'd noticed, he followed the man out of Harpers Ferry. Realizing that the outsider was sending a message, he attacked, killing the man and butchering the corpse to disguise his involvement. When people discovered the remains the next day, they worried that some new monster was on the loose. Sam waited, hiding in Harpers Ferry. When he heard his stealth aircraft hovering over the town that night, he knew that he'd acted too slowly in killing the outsider. As soon as the aircraft moved on, Sam ran back to his bunker. To protect himself from any presumed followers, he spread meat in the entry of the bunker, hoping to draw in predators. This worked better than he could have hoped for when Deathclaws entered the cave. Unfortunately, they wouldn't prevent his death. When word reached the congressional bunker at the White Spring that not only was Sam Blackwell alive, but that he'd killed the agent in Harpers Ferry, an assassin was sent to finish the former senator off. While they'd never managed to track down Quinn Carter and interrogate her as to Sam Blackwell's location, they did find her notes in the ruins of the Charleston Herald building and used them to track him down. The assassin, Agent Gray, tapped into the electricity of Sam's bunker to power a set of lures that distracted the Deathclaws, before descending the elevator into the bunker itself. While Sam Blackwell had a second layer of security in a laser grid, this wouldn't hold for long. Because of his worsening dementia, Sam was prone to forgetting things, and the bunker was full of helpful notes, including one that gave instructions on how to bypass the laser grid by cycling the bunker's power. Agent Gray did just that. Senator Sam Blackwell died at his desk, clasping a pistol firmly in his grip. As it turned out though, the senator would have the last laugh. In cycling the power in order to enter the safe room, Agent Gray had deactivated his lures. As he exited the bunker elevator, he was set upon by a Deathclaw and killed. Back in Harpers Ferry, people were worried about what or whoever had killed the man they'd found butchered, while some Free Staters worried that the body itself might be Sam Blackwell, who had disappeared when it showed up. Soon there would be bigger things at play though than the death of one man. When Duncan McCann's wife and sons were killed by feral ghouls, Duncan went to a very dark place. He organized a posse to hunt down the ferals of the mire. 8 fighters, along with a Mr. Gutsy robot, set out towards Valley Galleria. They did not return, leaving the walls of Harpers Ferry undermanned in the coming days. This would prove to be a horribly inopportune time to lose so many guards, as events beyond the control of the Free States or the people of Harpers Ferry would soon bring a new apocalypse. Miles away to the south in an old mine, a monster had been bred that would bring about the deaths of thousands. Around the start of June 2086, strange silhouettes darkened the sky of Harpers Ferry. Enormous bats, the size of a family car, attacked without warning, biting, scratching, screeching, and dusting the defenders with some sort of toxin. Many of those that were hit but not killed outright turned on their friends and began to attack on behalf of the bats. Completely unprepared for an attack of this nature, the surviving Free Staters and people of Harpers Ferry ran for their lives. The 7 years of hard work to turn the ruins of Harpers Ferry into a hub of civilization was undone in less than an hour. The Free Staters returned to their bunkers, while the non-Free Staters fled to whatever shelters they could find. In at least one case, the shelter they sought ended up being a Free States bunker. The Sunday brothers, Jesus and Juan Diego, had participated in the rebuilding of Harpers Ferry, but they were always on the sidelines. Jesus, the elder brother, had never truly believed that Harpers Ferry could be made safe, and thus he contributed the bare minimum. While Jesus had focused on protecting himself and his brother above all else, Juan Diego had chosen to get more involved in the community. When he started dating a wastelander named Brianna Hawk, Jesus was displeased. He didn't know why specifically, but he got a bad feeling about Brianna, a notion that led him to attempt to break them up every chance he got. When the attack hit Harpers Ferry, the Sunday brothers were at their cabin outside of town, and thus they were spared the horror of the assault. Jesus thought that he was free of Brianna until she showed up at the front door with a group of survivors seeking shelter. As Juan Diego attempted to let them in, Jesus knocked him out and fired into the air to scare them off. While this solution worked temporarily, Jesus soon discovered that when his brother was supposed to be hunting, he was actually meeting Brianna and giving her some of their supplies. When Jesus confronted Juan Diego over this treachery, an argument ensued. In a moment, Jesus lost the only thing in the world that was important to him, accidentally killing Juan Diego when he pushed him off a ledge. When they learned what happened, Brianna Hawk's people attempted to take the cabin and underlying bunker by force. Though he killed his attackers, Jesus was mortally wounded, succumbing to his wounds as he contemplated the afterlife due a man who murders his own brother. At the other Free States bunkers, grief rather than violence was the order of the day. While Neeraj Singh and his kids Abby and Calvin had returned to their bunker, the family they shared it with, the Cohens, were slain in the attack. Raleigh Clay lost his wife Trish and his daughter Martha. Raleigh immediately sent out a message telling everyone that they shouldn't attempt to reclaim Harpers Ferry. There was nothing to keep another attack from yielding the same result. He did the best he could to hold it together for his remaining children, but when he was alone, he drank and cursed Sam Blackwell, wondering where his oldest friend was and why he wasn't helping in their hour of need. While Sam was already slain by this time, he had actually encountered one of these enormous bats before. A couple of years prior to the attack on Harpers Ferry, before the death of his daughter Judy, Sam Blackwell had been out hunting when he saw a massive bat flying over the ridge. It saw him, screeched, and chased him as he ran for his life. Saved only by falling into a ditch too deep for the bat to reach him, he returned home covered in sweat, mud, and bruises, much to his daughter's concern. While initially she was fairly certain that this bat was a fragment of her father's demented mind, she soon had her own experience fleeing one of these massive creatures. Sam Blackwell said nothing of these experiences when he returned to Harpers Ferry, but whether he forgot or believed that the threat had passed, we'll never know. Even if he had warned Harpers Ferry, what chance is there that they would have both taken the threat seriously and actually made an effort to prepare for it? As it turned out, belief in the threat caused by these monsters would eventually become a major issue for the security of the post-war society at large. Hearing of the trouble in Harpers Ferry, the responders sent Derek J. Castle to investigate. When he arrived, he saw the devastation of Harpers Ferry and heard the stories of the conversions of those who'd been attacked to the side of the attackers. Raleigh Clay told him that the Free States were sticking to their bunkers for the time being until they could find a way to battle these beasts that had attacked, a response that Derek felt was selfish. As it turned out, the first responder to arrive in Harpers Ferry would also be the one to announce its fall to the responders. True to Raleigh's word though, the Free States immediately started to work on plans to fight the enemy they'd named the Scorched, a reference to the red, scalded appearance of the skin of those infected by the bats. The disease that caused the conversion of the Scorched was named the Scorched Plague, and the bats that spread it, the Scorched Beasts. Ella Ames, as the most qualified biological scientist of the group, naturally headed this effort just as she had when studying the ghouls. She soon discovered that the Scorched emit a unique radiation signature, a fact that Neeraj Singh would put to good use. Working with his daughter Abby, Neeraj began to create a system of sensors that would monitor the region for the Scorched, to either give the Free States a target to attack, or a warning to take shelter. If the sensors detected the Scorched, they would broadcast a signal to the nearest radio tower, which would then relay the information back to the bunkers. There were myriad problems with this system that would require constant innovation and repairs as the Scorched detection system was put into place. Given their limited manpower, Neeraj also developed automated systems that would repair any issues with the radio towers as those issues might arise. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood of Steel pulled their forces out of Camp Venture and moved south to an old insane asylum they renamed Fort Defiance. Little did the Free States know that while they were working to stem the tide of the Scorched, the Brotherhood was locked in a life or death battle with the Scorched Beasts, a fight they lost on August 18th and 19th, 2095, as Fort Defiance and the Thunder Mountain Power Plant fell to an unending onslaught of the Scorched Beasts. The final radio message of "Defiance has fallen" served as a cryptic warning to the rest of the post-war society. The Free States hadn't been in close communication with the Brotherhood at this time, and this message was poorly understood, leading Raleigh Clay to send an expedition to determine what had happened to the Brotherhood. This group, dispatched in March of 2096, soon discovered that the message did indeed mean that the worst had come to pass. The Brotherhood had fallen, and the Scorched Beasts were darkening the skies of the Mire. As Ella Ames turned her research from the Scorched to the Scorched Beasts, she noted that as bats, they were likely susceptible to sound. She theorized that if they determined the proper frequency of sound, they could use that frequency to confuse the beasts long enough to help take them down. At the same time, Raleigh Clay ordered the salvaging of anything useful from Camp Venture, leading to the discovery of the sonic generator, a piece of technology the Brotherhood invented to draw the Scorched Beasts in so that they could be killed. Neeraj and Abby Singh used these two technologies to create the plans for the Scorched Beast Trap, a device that the Free States would eventually construct in 12 locations across Appalachia. This effort required a near endless amount of work for the surviving Free Staters. Toward the end of 2096, the Free States found a man tampering with the Scorched Beast Trap. It was Hank Madigan, a former Brotherhood of Steel member who had joined the Responders when the Brotherhood had changed their mission from saving lives to saving technology. Hank Madigan was second in command of the Responders' elite firebreather unit, and he'd been on a series of solo missions across Appalachia, trying to find a way to defeat the Scorched threat as it had now crossed the mountains into their territory. While the Free Staters were reluctant to trust a former Brotherhood member, he eventually talked them into accepting his assistance with a Scorched detection system and the Scorched Beast traps. The Free States had hit a bit of a wall with the SDS, as they had needed to install an uplink for the system on the top of the ski resort known as the Top of the World, but they had been stymied by the raiders that had made the resort their home. Hank Madigan offered to install the uplink and headed into the mountains. That was the last they saw of him, as he was captured by the raiders and imprisoned within the Top of the World. In November 2096 at the Morgantown airport, the Responders made their last stand against the Scorched and fell, leaving only the raiders of the Savage Divide and the remnants of the Free States. While the raiders lasted a few more months, the Free Staters themselves were beginning to dwindle in number. While Ella and Neeraj had worked on the SDS, they'd made an unfortunate discovery. Neeraj was sick with a terminal illness, Parkinson's. While there might have been treatments for this in the years before the bombs, there was nothing that could be done for Neeraj. Although he recorded a message for his children to be delivered in the event of his death, he chose to keep his diagnosis to himself for the time being, knowing that it was a problem without a solution. Unfortunately, Ella, who was supposed to deliver the message, wouldn't survive long enough to do it herself. Along with Ella's work on the Scorched threat, she was also working to create better medications. This research required a lot of rare local flora. Ella Ames had many admirers in the Free States movement, both platonically and romantically, and some of these admirers were willing to perform dangerous tasks in the hopes of getting close to her. Sadly, not all of them would survive the tasks she gave them. One, who went by Cedric, died near Arctos Pharma. When she needed a rare flower that grew within the ruined Valley Galleria Mall, she dispatched eager volunteer Jacob Lerner. When he found himself surrounded by feral ghouls, Jacob was forced to spend the night in the mall before he managed to find the flowers. Upon exiting the mall, he was slain, not by the ghouls, but by Charlie Walker, his longtime competitor for Ella's attention. Ella herself would die on a trip to Raleigh Clay's bunker, where she had hoped to share her completion of a powerful anti-radiation drug, Radshield. Her death meant the loss of a vast amount of expertise by the Free States, and it also meant that when Neeraj died, the message Ella was supposed to deliver to his children stayed in its hiding spot in her lab. As the years went by, more and more Free Staters died. Soon, Abby Singh alone remained. A year after the death of her father, she decided that she wouldn't let his dream of the SDS die, and thus began a massive project. She did what she could do alone, but knowing that she might join her family and friends at any time, Abby created a vast series of recordings to guide anyone who might uncover her work after her death. In the end, she ran into the same wall that the Free States had hit before. There was no uplink at the Top of the World connecting the system. While she could potentially fix all the sensors and connect them all to the radio towers, she couldn't bring the whole system online without that uplink. She recorded a goodbye should she never return, and headed out to find the uplink. Alright, that just about does it for the story of the Free States, but I've got some things I want to say before closing this out. First, I want to note that Sam Blackwell's daughter Judith was not under threat by the Enclave when he took her underground. The threat Sam Blackwell received was a ploy by Harper Rosiak, Hornwright Industrial CEO Daniel Hornwright's fixer, to scare him out of the public eye. Sam Blackwell had come out against the Appalachian Prosperity Act, a ballot measure intended to replace all human workers in the state government with robots. Daniel Hornwright stood poised to make a fortune should the act pass, and thus, he wanted to scare Sam Blackwell out of the picture. He specifically told Harper Rosiak not to harm anyone, but to scare him. After having been threatened by the Defense Department, Sam believed that this was the military-industrial complex that was after him. Ironically, Daniel Hornwright's tactic might well have saved Senator Blackwell's life, as he had ample reason to hide in his bunker. In fact, we might be able to even credit Daniel Hornwright with saving the Free States movement. In a domino effect kind of way, if he hadn't threatened Sam Blackwell, he might not have gone to ground and taken the rest of the Free States with him in time to avoid the bombs. Second, in the narrative, I have the Clay riot as the cause of the arrest of Raleigh Clay. This is speculation on my part. Other than the name, Clay Riot, which came into the game with a Grafton pawn shop material in the run-up to Wastelanders, there's really no other information on the riot itself. We know that Raleigh Clay was wrongfully arrested at some point in late spring 2077, but as to why this happened, it's not listed. Third, in the narrative, I have it that Sam Blackwell handed Quinn Carter the documents announcing the secession of the Free States, but that's not explicitly stated in the lore. Simply put, Raleigh Clay wrote, quote, "Sam and I finally made the call. The Free States are officially underground. He handed over some documents declaring our secession, and that was that," unquote. Given that Sam Blackwell fled suddenly and was hesitant to leave his bunker even after the bombs, I think it's likely that he gave them to Quinn Carter when she came for the interview, rather than going out to some government office himself to hand them over. Fourth, in the narrative I say that Raleigh Clay gave the all-clear to leave the bunker. While this is true, it's not the whole truth. Raleigh relates in his log that he talked to both Sam Blackwell and Ella Ames before they all agreed on the all-clear signal that he broadcast to the rest of the bunkers. I wrote it as I did in the narrative because I hadn't introduced Ella Ames yet, and Sam Blackwell wouldn't re-enter the narrative for a long time. And it flowed better to use the shorter version of the truth than the whole truth just in that moment. Fifth, we can get a glimpse of the pre-war view of the Free States from the Overseer of Vault 76. In her holotape, Overseer's log, Free States, she calls Sam Blackwell and Raleigh Clay damn traitors, and shows her misconceived prejudice as she says, quote, "Sounds like they let go of their paranoia long enough to seek out help from other survivors," unquote. This statement is comically incorrect. First of all, the Overseer knew about the other Vault experiments, so she still calls the Free States paranoid? Next, the Free Staters left their bunkers to help rebuild, sharing their resources with the destitute, hungry, and sick. The Overseer is not a fool, she's simply indoctrinated with the mindset of the pre-war America. Sixth, I think we can, at least to an extent, excuse Derek Castle for not understanding the magnitude of the attack on Harpers Ferry and the threat that the Scorched posed. He didn't see the attack with his own eyes, and the Scorched, the Plague, and the Scorched Beast stand out among the other denizens of the post-war world. The concept that bats the size of small planes spreading a disease that caused the infected to join their attackers is pretty out there compared to even threats as exotic as massive mutated bugs and super mutants. Along with this, he likely had the same pre-war view of the Free States as the Overseer of 76, that the Free Staters were selfish traitors who only looked out for themselves. This flight from Harpers Ferry probably confirmed his pre-war anti-Free States prejudice, but I admit that I'm attempting to read his mind here. Seventh, there's a piece of lore that I really couldn't fit in here, and that's the stained note from Grafton Steel. In this note, a worker at Grafton Steel details a plan to break robot pods in the administration building. They say, quote, "Won't stop them forever, but it'll at least give us time to regroup with Raleigh," unquote. I don't really understand why Raleigh would be tied up in this for sure, but I did consider the possibility that Raleigh was a union activist in the same way that Sam Blackwell was once a union activist. It does make some sense, but we don't get any indication of that anywhere else, or for that matter, what Raleigh Clay did for work before the bombs. Eighth, there are no dates on any of the later Free States lore items. There's no telling when Abby Singh walked out of her bunker for the last time. I had always assumed that the Raiders dying out in 2097 was the end of all non-ghoulified, non-mutated life in Appalachia, but it now seems obvious to me that Abby survived potentially even into 2100 or later, living alone in her bunker. It's just difficult to know because after March 2096, there isn't any dated Free States lore. Ninth, Abby could still be out there somewhere. Her body isn't found anywhere in the game, and while this is true for many Free Staters, she tells us that they're dead. It also seemed possible that they survived, but I really can't imagine Raleigh Clay or Eddie Hayes leaving her alone to continue their work. I think in fact that Raleigh, Eddie, and Neeraj may have all died together working on a scorched beast trap, but that's just speculation on my part. Anyway, even though she could easily be dead, there's a chance that she found she couldn't install the uplink and decided to try to find a community out there somewhere. 10th, Abby may have actually been survived by another Free States member. There's a note in her bunker from someone named R. Fields asking where she is. The note warns her not to go to Watoga, as it's too dangerous. This really feels like something she would know by post-2096. It could be that this is an old note. It just seems odd that she would leave it up in her bunker. Lastly, I've mentioned this before as it's a major theme of the game. Isolation and lack of cooperation are what destroyed the post-war society. Every time I dive a little deeper into the lore, it becomes more and more obvious that while the Scorched and the Scorched Beasts did the killing, there's no reason that the tide couldn't have been stemmed if the factions had worked together. There are 8 individuals that together could have saved Appalachia if they weren't part of 3 different organizations. From the responders, you have Dr. Claire Hudson, Amy Carey, and Sanjay Kumar. From the Free States, Ella Ames, Abby Singh, and Neeraj Singh. From the Brotherhood of Steel, Grant McNamara and Haley DeCano. Ella Ames and Amy Carey both separately discovered that the Scorched emit a unique radiation signature that can be used to track them with the proper sensors. Sensors that were built by Neeraj Singh and Sanjay Kumar, respectively. Haley DeCano discovered that the Scorched Beast nests could be found by monitoring for a specific frequency. Grant McNamara discovered that with a proper frequency, the Scorched Beast could be lured to a specific point, while Ella Ames discovered that there's another frequency that could disorient the Scorched Beasts long enough to kill them. Grant and Ella's tech was used by Neeraj and Abby Singh to build the Scorched Beast traps. While Grant McNamara and Ella Ames both wanted to sequence the genome of the Scorched Beast to look for weaknesses, neither had access to the equipment to do so, as it lay in responder territory. Lastly, Dr. Claire Hudson did 99% of the work to create a Scorched Plague inoculation, which unfortunately came too late for all 3 organizations when it was finished in 2102 by the dwellers from Vault 76. Not working together led to redundant work and missed opportunities. When Ella tried to convince Raleigh to work with the responders post-fall of Harpers Ferry, he told her that they didn't have the resources required to cooperate, which is foolish as their combined efforts would have yielded better results with less wasted resources. With their efforts combined, I have little doubt that they would have succeeded without having to resort to the nukes. Truly, this was a failure of leadership across the board, as the responders and the Free States leadership didn't trust the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood practically ignored the Free States while they looted the responders. Alright, I think that's enough on the Free States. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Brian, and Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.